all. My name is Nick Leslie, and today I'm going to be talking about questions to ask when picking a tech stack. This is the second video on where to go now that you've taken softeng, and it's going to be a lot more theoretical than the first. It's going to be showing you more of how to evaluate the effectiveness of technologies and less about how to actually get started. So let's get right into it. First off, you got to ask yourself some business questions. I say business, but really it's just project questions. These are the non-CSE things that are constraints on your app. So first off, what are you building? You have to have an idea in mind. What you build makes a lot of difference on what tools you pick. I will pick very different things if I'm building a blog/portfolio as opposed to building a social media site. Then you need to consider how many users will this have. Is this going to be constant traffic, or is this going to be a once a month spike? How often will it need updates? How often will you need to be pushing changes, and how up to date are you going to keep it? Are you going to make a bunch of new features, or is it a one and done temporary dev dashboard? What deadlines have your client imposed? How long do you have to make it? What personal deadlines can you impose on you? Because deadlines are important in finishing your app. Oftentimes, if your goal is just to learn and you don't really have a strict deadline, it's way, way harder to finish a project. How many developers do you have? This makes a massive difference. I will choose specific technologies if I'm working with other people as opposed to on my own. Typically when I'm on my own, I experiment a little bit more because it's an opportunity to learn. But if it's with other people, I would just use Old Reliable. Finally, how marketable is your technology? Will someone be oh, I've heard that name? Think a bunch of people know what React is, despite the fact that they've never done tech. It's just because it's a name that Instagram used to build their app. So let's go into the general tech questions you have to ask. First off, how much experience do you have with the tool that you're using? This is super important. You are going to be faster if you have more experience in it. In general, if you're trying to finish something, pick something that you already know. But if you're trying to learn, then you can go with what you learn. How well does it fit your problem? Even if you know it super well, it might be super hard to work with your problem. For example, JavaScript is not that great for interacting with machine learning platforms, but Python is. So I probably wouldn't use an Express backend if I'm doing a machine learning app. And I'm going to go into something that you could use for a machine learning app later. How fun is it to work with? Is it really boring to develop with? This is more of a personal one for me because there are some techs that I just don't use because I don't find them fun. How good is the ecosystem? Are you going to be able to find libraries for your project? Are you going to be able to find Stack Overflow posts? That type of stuff. Ecosystem is really, really important because you can move really fast if you've got a really well-developed ecosystem. How good is the documentation? Can you learn everything you need to know about it from the docs, or are the docs poorly written and really hard to read? I will choose not to use libraries because their docs are poorly implemented. How mature is the tool? How long has it been around? How often have people used it? Is it a industry staple? You know that this is a robust set of tools, or is it a new thing with a lot of cool features? You kind of got to ask yourself if you need that new cool thing. How well maintained is it? Is it still getting updates? Is it getting security patches? Is it getting that type of stuff? All of those are things you need to consider, especially because sometimes you really want to keep your app up to the cutting edge. Other times it matters less. However, in general, make sure your app always gets security updates because there are some really nasty things that you just want to update out of your project. Finally, how are errors handled? Error handling is one of the most important things you can think about in software. And having a good error handling experience can make or break a development experience. For example, stuff like error boundaries in React make it really easy to stop the app from breaking when you have an error. Whereas try-catch blocks are kind of hard to work with in the sense when one thing throws in a try-catch block, you don't know what exactly threw. You just can see the error. So here's some front-end considerations and some front-end tools. And I'll go over the tools after I talk about the questions. So how much user interaction will you need? Is it a static site that you're reading, like a blog or a news article? Or do you need a lot of buttons and a lot of moving parts? Like, for example, I probably wouldn't use React for a blog just because it's kind of a lot of work to set up for something that can just be HTML. How easy is it to, like, reuse common components? So most modern front ends have a component system, but if you're working in an old system like jQuery or HTML, then you won't really have it where you can, like, generalize common components. So things to consider. How performant does your app need to be? Do you need lightning quick interactions, or is it okay if some things are a little bit more sluggish? How big is the bundle size? This is more on like how many libraries you want to download on top of your front end library, but bundle size is a huge thing in the sense that, like, if I am shipping my app in a country without really good internet, I don't want to have a huge bundle size because I don't want people to get stuck in like a trap of where they're downloading my app, they're running my app, but they need to download a bunch of JavaScript before they can run it. And then finally, and this app become cross-platform. So tools like React can compile into something called Electron, which allows you to make a desktop app, and then you can use React Native to make a mobile app. So you can actually make cross-platform apps using React. And if you need a cross-platform app, that's a great way to do it. So as for some frameworks, you all know React. You just spent 7 weeks working with React. You're very familiar with it. It's incredibly popular. Then there's Svelte. Svelte was made by Rich Harris of the New York Times, who now just full-time works on Svelte. It is the most HTML-like of all of them. And it is also compiled, which means that typically it has like smaller bundle sizes, and it can be a bit faster than something like React. Then you have Angular, which is made by Google, and it's very robust. A lot of companies use Angular. It's kind of based on the model view controller pattern, which is a very well-tested design pattern. Then finally, you've got Solid. And granted, these are not all of the front-end frameworks. Like, there's Vue, there's a bunch of other ones, but these are just the ones that I would recommend. Solid is really fast. It uses something called signals. So the way React re-renders stuff is that it actually, every time something changes, it re-renders itself and all of its children. Whereas Solid uses signals to basically warp reactivity to where it's needed, so it only re-renders the components that needs to be re-rendered. And a lot of other frameworks are taking signals, so it's worth looking into. However, I think for a lot of your own side projects, I would just stick with React because it's what you know. But if you're trying to learn, I would give one of these other ones a try. So backend considerations. This is like if you're trying to set up something that needs a dedicated backend. So how easy is it to set up a web server? Like, do you need a separate library, or is it built into the standard library? Go is really great in the sense that it has a really good HTTP framework built into the standard library. So you don't need that many dependencies. How well does the tool scale? So like Express, because JavaScript is single-threaded, doesn't actually scale that well. Whereas Go, because it's both a compiled language and concurrency is really fast, scales really well. Like, to make it so that every request is handled in a separate thread in Go, all you've got to do is put Go in front of a function, and then it's put in a separate thread. This is really, really powerful. How much setup do you need to host it? Like, do you need a dedicated server? You can get away with using these things called Lambda functions that are These are functions that are spun up on demand, and you don't need a dedicated server to host your backend. However, with stuff like Go, you kind of need a dedicated server. What tech are you targeting? Like, is it a web thing? Is it desktop? Are you, like, trying to build a video streaming platform? In that case, JavaScript's probably not the best idea. Or are you trying to build something that you can, like, that isn't super performance critical, like the Brigham Women's Health app? Nothing in that app is, like, needs to be lightning fast, so you could get away with using Express. Finally, how will you handle authentication/authorization? This is both a front-end and back-end question, but, like, are you going to store user data? Are you going to have multiple levels of authentication? Is this fully public? How are you going to handle, like, payments if you're making your API a, like, paid service? That type stuff. And then, do you need multiple smaller backends? This gets into a design pattern called microservices, where you basically split up your app into a bunch of mini things that handle one thing. So you've got like a set of servers that are just payment, and then you've got a set of servers that are just pathfinding. What tech you choose kind of depends. And really, there's no wrong answers. So like you've got Express, which is great if you're trying to move fast, but it's JavaScript, so it won't scale as well. You've got Flask. If you're doing machine learning, I would recommend looking into Flask, because Python is the main tool of choice for machine learning apps, and so Flask is the way to do that over HTTP. Then you've got Rust. Rust is touted as like the memory safe language. The White House put out a press briefing saying, hey, if you're thinking about starting a project in C, just use Rust instead. Rust forces you to be type safe and memory safe at compile time. So it is impossible to compile with things like memory leaks and security faults. So if you're doing an app that needs to be secure and performant, use Rust. And finally, Go. Go is a really simple language. What it does is it's got like 40 keywords, it makes concurrency really easy, and it has a garbage collector, so you don't need to manage your own memory, but it's compiled, which means that it's wicked fast. Honestly, I would recommend Go for pretty much any backend that can't be run on a Lambda function. If you need some state, I personally would use Go. So, full stack framework considerations. We talked a bit about this in the last video, but for those who didn't watch it, what a full stack framework is it's a front end or back end that gives you a little bit of the powers of both. So for example, in Next, Solid, and Svelte, you're mostly oriented on front end, but you can set up basic HTTP routes for handling stuff like some small quick running algorithms, or just like basic database stuff. There's a like idea called CRUD, which generally stands for like create, read, destroy. Create, read, update, destroy. So it's just like you're using your backend to update a database. If that's all you're doing, I would use a full stack framework, because it makes it really easy to do and fairly price effective, because you're only spinning up these functions as customers need them. But if you need state in your backend, then I wouldn't recommend using most of these, except for HTMX. What HTMX does is it expands HTML to make it so that you can use post requests to swap out certain parts of your HTML from the server. It's basically the backend version of a front-end framework. If you're a backend engineer who hates all of like the way that frameworks handle reactivity and stuff, I would look into HTMX. It's a really small library, really easy to use, and it makes making reactive backend sites really cool. Additionally, a lot of these come with server-side rendering. This means that the HTML is made on the server and then sent to the client. This is different from how most JavaScript frameworks work. What they do is they do a step called like hydration, where they actually like initially you just send over JavaScript in React, and then React builds your site on the fly. Whereas with Next, Solid, and Svelte, so Next, Solid, Start, and Svelte Kit, you can have an option to server-side render some of your pages, and so you can like render HTML out. Additionally, these server-side pages can access the database directly. So if you have a table that doesn't need to be interactive, that needs to get stuff from the database, you don't need to do the full like, okay, a use effect to like fetch the data. You can just have your page fetch it at compile time and then compile with all the stuff you need. And then finally, how will I host the apps? These play really well with sites like Vercel, but don't play as well with basic with stuff like AWS. They still can work, but you don't get the advantages that like Lambda functions bring. Anyways, I'd highly recommend looking into these for personal projects. Database question. So there are two classifications of database. There's SQL databases and there's NoSQL databases. SQL databases store stuff in the known like row column scheme, whereas NoSQL typically stores stuff as JSON blobs. And you kind of got to just ask, do you want SQL or NoSQL? There's benefits to both, and I would recommend researching it. But some of the advantages is a lot of NoSQL databases you can actually communicate to directly from the front end. Be very careful with this. If you're sending over code that can communicate to the database that's running on a client's device, this is a security risk. You can do it, and if you manage it well, it's not a problem, but be very, very careful. You also need to consider scalability. Typically, the database is the hardest part to scale because it needs state. State is typically like inverse to how scalable your app is. And so, like, do you need stuff like sharding? Do you need multiple availability regions? Some databases are going to work really well with this. Like, for example, Cassandra was chosen by Netflix because it's a NoSQL database that scales really well. It's built to be distributed. Whereas something like SQLite, which is SQL but just run in a file, doesn't scale very well. For side projects, I would highly recommend going with like something like SQLite or like Mongo, because I like SQLite because I can run it in a file. So if I just spin up like one Linux box, I put my like database file on there and it's kind of good. It's great if you're not planning on having a lot of users. There's also stuff like Postgres, MySQL, all that. Finally, talking about deployment, the number one thing to consider when picking a deployment service is how much money will it cost you. Every single cloud platform is out there trying to charge you an arm and a leg for hosting your stuff. Granted, it's cheaper than hosting your own service, and it's servers. Sometimes it's cheaper to host your own servers, but it's less management. But they're specifically pricing these services to make it like pay as you go. So be very, very careful. The big ones are AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. These are the big three. But then there's stuff like Heroku and Vercel that are like side cloud vendors. And some of them are built on top of the infrastructure of other cloud platforms. Vercel, for example, is that. But look very carefully at the pricing scheme of your cloud provider. You also need to consider how well does your cloud provider scale. And granted, all of these can scale to the moon. It's just how much are you willing to pay /setup. And you can actually use stuff like there are infrastructure as code tools to set up your infrastructure in like a scripting language format. Those are pretty good. You also got to look at how easy is it to deploy. It is 10x easier to deploy on a platform like Vercel that bundles in the developer experience than it is to deploy on something like Amazon, Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform kind of act as the basic do-it-yourself versions of cloud providers, but you can actually get like premium cloud providers that bundle developer experience on top of their costs. They're a bit more costly, but they're typically easier to do. And then finally, how easy is it to move data off of your service? Cloud providers typically charge something called an egress fee. What this is it is a cost to exit. And this is usually really high because their goal is to do something called vendor lock-in. They don't want you moving from their platform. They want to keep charging you for a long, long time. So these egress fees are actually really high. Except now I think the EU is suing to get these egress fees down. But for now, I would generally look at how easy it is to migrate off these services. So here's the example tech stack that I would use. It includes some extra libraries. So I would use, for a side project, I would use Next.js because it's a full stack JavaScript framework. So I don't have to set up a backend. And because of server-side rendering, I can make it like fairly performant and pay as you go. I would use NextAuth for my authentication. This is the same as Auth0. However, I don't have to go through Auth0 directly. I can kind of use my own whatever authentication provider I want. I could use Google, I could use Twitter, and I don't need the Auth0 homepage. I'll still be redirected to the other site's logins, but it's pretty good. I think it only works for Next.js, so look into different authentication libraries if you're using a different frameworks. I personally love Tailwind CSS. I think that it simplifies CSS. I saw a really good video where what it said is, hey, with CSS you can make anything, but that also extends to the bad side, where because Tailwind creates like these smart constants, it generally means that your app is a little bit more restrictive, but it also limits how bad it can look. And the best part about Tailwind is that it can mix with other CSS. You can just use normal CSS with Tailwind on top, and that's great. As for how I would communicate with the database, I would use Keysly. It is a query builder. This is different from what we used in Prisma. So ORMs like basically map objects to like database stuff. And this can get tricky when it gets complex, whereas query builders are just basically a wrapper for building SQL in a more intelligent way. Basically, all it provides me is type-safe SQL in TypeScript, and I like this. I would personally host on Vercel if I wasn't like doing anything with a dedicated backend, just because it is free if you don't go over their usage tiers, and it's really, really easy to set up with. As for my database, I would use Postgres or SQLite. It kind of depends on where I want to host my database. But that's up to you. I don't have as much opinions on database yet because my apps aren't big enough to where I need to worry about databases. So here are some extras to add. If I need a stateful backend or like I want something that's long running, I would use Go. I would just have a full stack framework that I proxy into Go. So like when I hit a specific route on my API, I just get sent to my Go API. I think that this is a really good way to get the benefits of like speed of development you get with a full stack framework, with also getting the benefits you get from like a dedicated backend. For infrastructure, I like using an infrastructure as code tool. This means that I can declare my infrastructure in one code config file, and I can like set up all of my infrastructure in one command and tear it all back down. I mostly like this because it means my infrastructure is self-documenting, so I can look at one file and see, oh, that's what my AWS looks like. So there's this idea called CI/CD, and what it is when you push code, you run all your tests, and ideally, when you push to main, you're deploying to production. Continuous integration and continuous development. I use GitHub Actions for this because it's built into GitHub and it's really easy to use. So highly recommend looking into GitHub Actions. Finally, if your app needs caching, which is where instead of looking at a database, you look at a cache, this is a great way to speed up your app. I might, if people are interested, release a third video on like how to structure your infrastructure / build your app. And there I'll talk more about Redis and caching. But if you need caching, use Redis. This is like how you can set up a basic Next.js example, or watch my first video, just some basics on what it is. And finally, I'm going to end with resource to learn. These are YouTubers and one blog that I personally love. The one caveat is that a lot of these aren't tutorials. I'm not necessarily giving you tutorials. I'm giving you people that I think have good opinions about technology that you can learn from. Dreams of Code does excellent videos on infrastructure and general programming habits. Some of the best that I've ever seen. It is more tutorially than the other ones, but it is in general excellent. The animation quality is really good. Highly recommend. Theo T3G UG is like a front-end startup developer who has a lot of good opinions on the state of front-end, at least in my opinion. Highly recommend looking at them for their stuff. The Primogen is an ex-Netflix engineer who works on a lot of their stuff, does really funny software content, and on one of their other side channels, they read technology blogs and react to them. I like this because by reading blogs, I'm getting the opinion of one developer, and then I'm listening to the opinion of a senior engineer who I trust on top of it. I think that this is a really good way to learn about like the ecosystem around software. Low-level learning, if you're interested in backend and security, highly recommend checking them out. Fireship, I think this is by far the most popular code channel. They're just great. Recommend checking them out for like dev news, and like their in 100 seconds video is a great way to learn about the basics of technology. Finally, give the Grug Brain developer a read. It is an excellent guide on why you should keep software simple. It is hilarious and gives you some excellent advice. But overall, thank you for taking softeng, and thank you for listening, and I hope that you all go out and build some really cool stuff.